I just want to say something about our next meeting, which will be in 2 weeks' time on Thursday, June 11th at 5 p.m., the same time as now, in which we will be hosting this, the authors, the two authors of this book in front of you, Dr. Joseph Rappaport and Dr. Emily Savage-Smith, to talk about the latest book, Lost Maps of the Caliphs, Drawing the World in 11th Century Cairo. This is a fantastic book. This is a great find. It's a Fatimid book that was discovered and acquired by the Bodleian Library of Oxford University about 10 years ago. And the two authors will be taking us to the maps of this book and how to read them and what it tells us about 10th and 11th century worlds viewed from Cairo, and many other things. So I promise you it will be worth your while if you can make it. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce the speaker tonight, Dr. Robert Springborg, who is adjunct professor at the School of International Studies in Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and also he's a non-residential research fellow of the Italian Institute of International Affairs in Rome. Dr. Springborg is a renowned expert on the political economy of the Middle East with wide-ranging interests and a very active career, literally all over the world. Before moving to Vancouver, Canada, he taught at Canterbury University, Sydney University, College of Europe at Warsaw, UPenn, UC Berkeley, the Naval Postgraduate School, Sciences Po, and
very good.
He was also the director of the London and Middle East Institute at
No, go ahead, sir.
Before then, of the American Research Center in Egypt back in 1999 or 2000, and that's when he and I first met. This is 20 years ago. He's the author of countless academic and journalistic articles, as well as numerous books. I will just list 5 of them in chronological order. In 1982, he published this landmark study, Family, Power and Politics in Egypt, Sayyid Bimarai, his clan, clients and cohorts. I remember him telling me that back then, people, when he was working on his dissertation, his PhD dissertation, in the early years of Sadat, people were pointing to Sayyid Marai as the power to be. As it happens, that didn't turn out to be the case, and in a sense, he caught up with events and eventually published this very important book on Egypt, 1989, Mubarak's Egypt, the fragmentation of the political order, on the person who ended up being the power to be. In 2001, together with Clem Moore-Henry, he published Globalization and Politics of Development in the Middle East. And in 2001, Oil and Democracy in Iraq, an edited book. And we were very fortunate to actually launch this book here in Cambridge a couple of years ago, when he graced us with his presence to launch a very, very important, I mean, as simple as the title looks, this is a very, very complex book, and it is a must read for anyone interested, not only in the recent history of Egypt, but the structure of political system in Egypt. Today's presentation is titled Deep States and Deep Trouble in the MENA.
The concept stretched too far. those of you who follow American politics, and just about unfortunately everyone has to, you'll be aware that this concept of deep state has appeared in the lexicon of American politics, introduced by none other than President Trump for the most part. And this is one of the rare cases where, if you will, a social science concept which originated in the Middle East, in this case in Turkey, has spread globally, more, let's say, in contemporary politics, usually is a term of condemnation, rather more than it has in social science analysis. So it's an interesting idea, and I shall begin with putting the question to you as to whether or not the deep states of the Middle East are in any way equivalent to the deep state of the Democratic Party, which President Trump claims is seeking to undermine his presidency, and indeed it's spread in other democracies as well. So that's sort of an underlying theme to which I'll return, but the real focus of the talk is on the role played by deep states in Middle Eastern political economies. And as I said, it's sort of a component, not a terribly major one, because the most important part of this book is, in a sense, the attempt to document the relative capacities of Middle East, North African states, and so it's fairly data rich in that regard. And the deep state is more a conceptual idea than an empirically driven one. But having said that, let me just walk through the argument of the book to bring you to where deep states play what I think is quite a critical role and an underestimated one within political economy analysis. And so the argument starts in the book and here today with the underperformance of the Middle East and North Africa. And that underperformance, most of you, indeed probably all of you, are quite aware of. And if just give you some sort of dashboard reports about these various dimensions, economically, politically, and so on. Economically, I like the 30-30-30 rule to sort of sum it all up. The 30-30-30 rule is about 30% of youths in the Middle East, North Africa are unemployed. About 30% of populations are living under poverty lines, and about 30% of governmental budgets are devoted to debt servicing. So that's just sort of an overall dashboard indicator of underperformance. Last 3 years, GDP per capita in the Middle East and North Africa has declined. The GDP per capita in Middle East and North Africa is about 1/10 the average of other middle income developing countries. So you can go on, and I won't, but the economic performance in the Middle East has for quite a long time been extremely poor. Politically, what are the measures of underperformance? The standard measure of governance is that of the World Bank's governance indicator, started in 1996-97. And the Middle East, North Africa, has the distinction of being the only region in the world on which the performance on the 6 dimensions of the governance indicators has declined since that time. So politics are not just governance, they include other dimensions, such as the relative strength of states on the State Fragility Index. Middle East and North Africa is right at the bottom. And then if we go further to authoritarianism, unfortunately, by all the measures of authoritarian government, Middle East is right at the top. Provision of security, Middle East and North Africa is far and away the least secure region in the world by any measure. The region has 6% of the global population. It has 1/3 of the internally displaced persons in the world as a whole. It has about 1/4 of total refugees in the world. It is far and away the largest spender per capita and as a proportion of GDP on its militaries. So it is spending more and getting less for security. Human resource development. There are 2 measures that come immediately to mind. One is population rate growth. Middle East, North Africa is now some 500 million. It will have 1 billion people by 2050. So it is doubling its population in the next more or less 30 years on what is already, by most estimates, an overpopulated region. The second indicator is how well is it training its population. And the sort of dashboard indicator of that is learning, what the World Bank has come up with recently, learning adjusted years of schooling. And this means by now the increasing use of standardized international tests, of which I suppose PISA is the most standard of them now. The Middle East, North Africa average student in his late high school years is actually educated to a level 3 years behind the average for the rest of the world. In other words, 3 years of that educational experience of some 7 or 8 years is actually wasted. So human resource development is extremely poor. Regional integration, the next bar down here, it's a paradox in the sense that on the one hand, the Middle East, North Africa is one of the best, especially its Arab core, is one of the best integrated regions of the world in terms of interaction, as measured, let's say, by the Al Jazeera phenomenon, meaning the satellite Arabic broadcasting, which stretches across the entirety of the Arab world, which is absolutely unique for any world region. There is no equivalent in Latin America, Africa, and so on. But whereas the interaction between peoples, as suggested by the Al Jazeera effect, is not mirrored by effective integration of institutions. And there is a whole literature on what those measures are. The best one is cross-border trade within the region, which has stagnated in the Middle East at about 8% of total trade for the average country over the past 2 decades and even more, whereas intra-country trade within, say, the European Union is in excess of 60%. Mercosur, the various other regional organizations all have much higher cross-border trade within the region than does the Middle East and North Africa. And then lastly, underperformance, environmental challenges. Middle East, North Africa is the world's driest region. It has done relatively little to address that problem. And so it will continue to grow, along with various other environmental problems, which are less serious, but still important. Now, how do we explain this underperformance? Well, the book attempts to sort of plumb the literature about these explanations. And the one that possibly has had the most attention is that of the impacts of colonialism and neo-colonialism. And you are all familiar with these arguments, I'm sure, whether ranging from dependency theory to ones that are sort of empirically based in the Middle East, and the way in which relationships between center and periphery have been organized to the disadvantage of the latter. So there's a long history of drawing upon the rather unique experience of the Middle East in explaining its underperformance in these terms, going back indeed even to pre-colonial times, whether it's Roman conquest, whether it's Crusaders, and so on. So there's a very long stretch here in which external interference has been seen as a primary cause of the failure of the Middle East North Africa to develop more rapidly. A more recent addition to the literature is the resource curse, and it, when boiled down to its essence, has 2 components. The first component is the rentier state, that the dependence upon hydrocarbon extraction and exportation created rentier states that by their nature were not effective developers. And there is much discussion now, of course, of diversification of these economies, and we'll come to that in a minute. The second component, if you will, of the resource curse is the Dutch disease. The idea that being dependent upon exportation of hydrocarbons, for which the world has been in the past at least willing to pay quite a high price, has revalued Middle East North African currencies, and by so doing undermined the competitiveness of other tradable goods and services. And indeed, all the data shows that Middle East North African currencies have, since the great oil boom of 1973, been significantly overvalued and for the most part remain so. Religiosity is another one of the sort of standard explanations. It takes a couple of forms. One is Islam, but most notably Islamic law. that there are particular features, either present or absent, within Islamic law that have been inimical to more rapid economic growth. One of them is, and maybe the longest documented one, is al-Kaf, the idea of religious endowments, which are alleged by their detractors to prevent the effective management of assets, especially over time, has caused the fragmentation of ownership and control of key assets and therefore prevented overall development. A more contemporary argument about religion and primarily Islam, although not exclusively in the Middle East, is that it's associated with a set of values. And the literature about this comes from the effort by a team that for many years now has been running a series of global public opinion surveys about values and attitudes. This is the World Values Survey. And what that World Values Survey in each of its now, I guess, 4 iterations has demonstrated is that Muslim majority countries are heavily clustered at what is the lower left-hand part of the graph, which plots along the 2 axes a traditional, sort of traditional dimension, in other words, respect for traditional authority, and the horizontal dimension being that of the importance of material return as opposed to ideational returns. And so what the finding of the World Value Survey with regard to Muslim majority countries, which is the vast majority of the Middle East, is that they tend to be far more traditionally oriented towards authority and much more concerned with material return than other peoples. And so it is this overall value structure, according to those who work in this area, that is inimical to broader economic growth. So take it or leave it, there you are. It's another explanation. Then there are those who focus on the particularities of the Middle East, North Africa's economic history. And there's some rather nice little arguments here. Charles Assawi put forward the argument years ago to the effect that the undervaluing of non-animate energy, paradoxically, in the Middle East and North Africa was a serious problem. So the example that he used was the use of windmills and water mills in Europe as compared to Middle East and North Africa, where windmills were basically unknown and water mills outside of the Orontes and a few other areas extremely rare. And so the use of inanimate energy is what propelled more rapid economic growth in Europe than the Middle East and North Africa. Another particularity of Middle East economic history was Richard Bullitt's famous study of the camel and the wheel. And it was the argument that following the Romans and their roads in the Middle East and North Africa, the reconquest, if you will, by the indigenous of the area caused them to favor camel traffic. And camel is a beast of burden, effective as it is, over the building and maintenance of roads. And that it was that failure to develop a road network which underlay the economic isolation of regions of the Middle East and prevented the sort of growth of trade. And there's several other little explanations of this sort. And in summation, each one of them plays, it seems to be some role, and they're all rather interesting to have a look at, but they have in large measure been supplanted by a more omnibus explanation, which is current in political economy explanations, not just of the Middle East and North Africa, but for the world as a whole. And they really go back. Okay, so bringing the state back in was really the contribution of Chalmers Johnson, who wrote a book published in 1982 on what was really the precursor to the East Asian economic miracle. And it was focused on the Japanese economy. And that stimulated a growth industry of the developmental state And originally it was focused on East Asia and its core Confucian states, of which China is the most important. There are three others. And it was the argument that really you can talk about all these other factors, as I just did, for example, but the core of it is how effective is the state. And in subsequent years, our sinologist colleagues have really worked this idea over extremely well, getting all sorts of correlations going back to the first emperor, that is the 3rd century BC, between state capacities and local development performance in China in a whole host of different ways. So it's pretty convincing, at least in the Chinese and let's say more broadly the Confucian context. These ideas were picked up by the World Bank and they were sort of lumped together under neo-institutional economics, of whom Douglas North was the principal practitioner. And he made the argument that there are really two ways of understanding development states. Limited as opposed to open access orders. And I won't go into what became an enormous literature on this subject, other than to say that it furthered the bank's interest then in taking a look at the nature of states and how they approach development. And it gave rise to what is an increasing body of empirical research. To the most recent book, Crony Capitalism by Ishak Dewan and Adil Malik, is an example of exactly that. It's a compilation of studies trying to correlate developmental outcomes with cronyism, which is a manifestation of the limited as opposed to the open access order. So it's neo-institutional economics has become the dominant view in the bank, and it's probably the single most important concept used now in comparative economic performance by the bank. As sort of a third body of literature that feeds into this is that of globalization. And Khaled was kind enough to show in the introduction the cover of a book I did with Clem Henry, in which we, following in the footsteps of many others, tried to relate state capacities to their abilities to respond to the threats and opportunities of globalization. And the paradox that I referred to here on the slide is that the Middle East and North Africa was, in some senses, and certainly in the abstract, one of the world's great beneficiaries of globalization. And that was as measured by demand and price for oil. As globalization stimulated economic growth, so did the quantities and the prices of oil increase, and much to the overall aggregate economic benefit of the Middle East and North Africa. But the paradox was that neither regimes nor peoples in the Middle East wholeheartedly embraced globalization. That this region of the world was more suspicious of this phenomenon than most others, and we may say in retrospect, and rightly so. But that, I'd say the jury is still out on that. But in any case, that was the paradox. So the Middle East was only a half-hearted supporter of, and only halfway capable as well, of benefiting from globalization. The other idea that goes into this idea of capacities is Michael Mann, who's a historical sociologist, who coined the term infrastructural power. And infrastructural power can be boiled down to the capacities of states to interact effectively with their peoples. And there are a myriad of little examples of that, and just some homey ones. The spread of informal housing, for example, in Egypt, with no known addresses for a vast majority of people living in them, renders identification of people extremely difficult, contacting them, identifying them. And then when you add in that the Middle East and North Africa is one of the most underbanked regions of the world, with one of the lowest rates of filing of income tax, that government's information about its peoples is extremely limited, and going the other direction, the opportunities for access of citizens to their governments are extremely limited as well. So infrastructural power is very weak. And then lastly, when we're talking about states and their capacities, in the past decade or so, the proliferation of empirical measures, driven largely by the bank, but picked up by other institutions and individual scholars, is to try to measure globally these state capacities, of which there are 3 or 4 key ones, and I won't go into them. But so all of the sort of intellectual as well as empirical raw material is there. Now I can't advance the another technical glitch. I'm trying to advance the slide and I cannot.
Just go with your mouse to the bottom left. Yes, bottom left. Yeah.
Well done, Colin. Thank you. Thanks. But you cannot borrow, and this is to presage some comments about the deep state, a concept that's developed in one region of the world without modification to another. And so if you're going to take this developmental state idea, generated originally out of Japan and then spread more widely in East Asia, you need to make it fit the realities of the Middle East and North Africa. So what's the difference? Well, as we just noted, security is much more deficient in the Middle East and North Africa than it is throughout East Asia. The populations of the Middle East and North Africa are more diverse religiously and ethnically than they are in East Asia. And colonialism was a much less disruptive force, even though it was disruptive, but not as disruptive in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, I don't have my, let's see here. The second point, the upper, large bullet, if you will, in the upper right-hand corner, that economists are the architects, although Chalmers Johnson was a political economist, but the idea was picked up by economists. They are not interested in the politics of political economy, if you will. They're more interested in the economic outcomes. And so when you have, in the Middle East and North Africa, limited access orders in which the guardians of that access, the guardians of the perimeter of the inner core of the state, play such an important role, and you entirely dismiss it, you simply ignore it, as the economists have done, even the most recent studies, for example, then you're missing a very important element in the understanding of the political economy of the region, and that's where our deep states come in. Then the blue bullet down here, stateness is highly varied in the MENA, and whoop, whoop, whoop. And I'm missing a slide here, but never mind. Let's leave it at that that point. And now pick up on the idea of deep states as the guardian of the border between the elite within the perimeter and everyone else outside of it. So what's then the history of the explanation of that phenomenon of deep states? And it's contested. Jean-Pierre Feliu of the Sciences Po had a book about 3 years ago now saying that essentially this is a feature that dates back to Mamlukian rule. It's part of the nature of the Mamlukian states, that they were essentially foreigners who occupied the countries which they then ruled and remained largely foreign from them. So they comprised a state which was largely unknown to their own populations and which ruled in their own interest. Charles Tripp, although not directly rebutting Filou, nevertheless made a very strong argument against that, saying, no, we have to understand deep state as arising within the context of colonial rule. And his model for this was Iraq. And I guess the classic example of it was the British colonial official sitting in the outer office of the Iraqi minister, and all of the power residing within that outer office of the colonial official. So the deep state was a colonial idea to maintain power, while the superficial structure of the native state was put up there basically as disguise of that continuation of colonial power. Joseph Sassoon doesn't use the term deep states, but he traces authoritarianism in such a way that it is very similar to the idea of deep states. Now, what are the variations between them? Relations with ruling elites, top down versus bottom up. All right, so these deep states in all cases have coercive power. They are hidden, as the term suggests, but they have different relations going up and down the political ladder. In the case of Egypt and the classic authoritarian regimes of Saddam and Hafez al-Assad, they were created from the top down. They were instruments of the ruler and subordinate to that ruler. The Turkish case, from where we got the term deep states, was somewhat different, interestingly enough. And it was a convenience there when the military in 1950 surrendered direct control of government. It decided that it couldn't really trust the civilians to run the state, and it would have to therefore create a deep state that would set the limits to what the government could do. And as time went on, that deep state in Turkey began to sort of freelance throughout the political economy, making connections with criminal elements, engaging in a variety of illegal activities and so on. But that deep state, dating back to 1950, had a, as I say, a hands-off relationship with the ultimate power, because it had its own interests to pursue. And it did do so, and it was only brought to heel basically in 2016 with the failed coup attempt. And then there are the so-called bottom-up deep states, built on the basis of militias in the countries identified here, in which the idea is to, using an Australianism here, to white ant or termite out the state, to sort of hollow it out from the inside, penetrate it, and then control its resources and so on. So there are different relations, top down and bottom up. The composition differ as well. Some are based almost entirely on relationships within and between formal institutions, such as in Egypt. And then there are those based on informal networks, typically within a particular social force, a sect, a tribe, a region. And Saddam's Iraq, Assad's Syria are good examples of those. And then there are different sources of material goods for deep states. And there are those of you who followed the career of Mansour Olson, a political economist at Maryland, know in his rather flowery prose the reference to stationary and roving bandits. So the stationary bandit is, in this case, the deep state that realizes it's better to facilitate some sort of growth and economic activity, because its return over the long haul by being capable of expropriating the returns to those activities is a better strategy than that of the roving bandit, Mansour Olson's term, which is essentially to grab whatever you can, however you can, without regard to the future. And so there are deep states then that exemplify both the stationary bandit idea, of which Egypt is possibly the best example, and then there are a bunch of roving bandit ones, of which the Asads in Syria were a prime case. And one's personal recollections there I'd enjoy sharing with you about how you deal with roving bandit deep states and how they gather their resources. Now, non-material resources there. Now, I know time is getting short here, so I won't belabor this point. But they are three different sorts. They're informational, and the stationary bandits, deep states, need more information about the states and the communities that they are actually governing, and so they try to get as much information as they can. Whereas the roving bandits don't need information; they need security information in all cases. But after that, they don't need too much, and so the information resources vary. Ideational, the means by which they justify, because people are aware of their presence, even though they don't know the exact boundaries of the deep state from the nominal state and so on. So they have to create ways of justifying them. And this is the soft power of these deep states. And maybe the best example of this is not, in fact, Middle East and North Africa, it's Putin's Russia. Whereas the development of soft power by him has been extraordinarily well thought out and well articulated, and it's created the idea that this deep state is synonymous with the interests of the nation, much like in Egypt, the interests of the military are synonymous with those of the nation. And then relational resources are how these deep states connect into formal and informal structures and to civil society. Okay, what are the costs then of deep states? The first and most important is they render politics irrelevant. They convert real politics into pseudo-politics. You're all familiar with the phenomena of weak institutions, of weak parliaments, of weak political parties, and so on. All of these are manifestations then of pseudo-politics. What they do doesn't really determine significant policy outcomes. They are there as much as camouflage as anything else. Secondly, deep states deny citizenship. You can't have full citizenship rights and have deep states. And this in turn makes the development of infrastructural power impossible. And another term one can even use, it is to some extent a side effect, but also overlaps with the idea of infrastructural power. And that's public brain power. And that concept was developed by our friends in Norway, who, when they discovered gas and oil in the North Sea and their portion of it, wanted to be as effective as possible and as democratic as possible in their development and marketing of that resource. And so the Norwegians developed what they called the Norwegian model of public brain power, of having very widespread consultation by all conceivable stakeholders in the establishment and operation of hydrocarbon policies and the investments of the returns from them. So when you have a deep state that's controlling things, needless to say, public brain power is not possible. And just as a footnote, the world's largest sovereign wealth fund now, far and away, is the Norwegian one with $1 billion of assets. Extremely well managed, and given Norway's relative resources to population has far outperformed the sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East and North Africa. Shadow states, as Charles Tripp argued, with the reference to British colonial officials in Iraq, undermine the formal institutions of authority. Everyone knows that those institutions that you can actually see and have a building don't really have the authority. It's a shadow state, which is Charles Tripp's term, for in which real power is exercised. And then there are the direct and indirect costs of resources, whether garnered by stationary or roving bandits. So far, I've been referring to republics, and it raises the question of what about the monarchies? do we have deep states in monarchies? And you can argue, to a much lesser extent, if indeed at all, their relative resources are greater than the republics overall. There are a couple of exceptions, but overall significantly greater. And so they have resources to be able to pay for the cost of patrimonialism to a much greater extent than the republics. The founders of the monarchies were, by definition, not commoners. They had legitimacy by virtue of their previous roles, typically as tribal sheikhs, and that stands in comparison to people such as Saddam or Hafez al-Assad or Gamal Abdel Nasser and so on. So they had sort of an inherent legitimacy, which has, in some views, been very important to their rule, thereby reducing the need for a deep state. The societal cohesion, if you compare measures of societal fragmentation along ethnic, religious lines between the monarchies and the republics, the monarchies are more cohesive. They are much less heterogeneous. So that's another factor. And then the dynastic side, we're not talking, except in reading two cases, Jordan and Morocco, of, we're talking about family dynasties, as Professor Herb has identified, and there is a strength in family dynasties, which has traditionally been manifested most importantly at times of successions of power, although that's, as MBS in Saudi has indicated, is becoming yet more difficult. But so the monarchies have had certain advantages that has not made it necessary for them to use deep state power in anything like the same measure as the republic. Now, Jordan is the most different of the monarchies in terms of its reliance upon a deep state. And it's just the flip side of what I just argued. The resources of Jordan are limited. The military, the Arab Legion, played a vital role in the building of the Jordanian state. The dynasty is much smaller based on the Hashemite family. And Jordan is societally bifurcated between the East Bank population and Palestinian. So it has none of the characteristics of the other monarchies that have rendered them less dependent upon deep states. But let me conclude this section on the monarchies by saying, well, wait a minute, things are changing. First, rent to population rent ratios are declining as the quantities and prices of oil in world trade decline. So the capacity to maintain patrimonial orders is being undermined. No region in the world has militarized more intensively and expensively than the key GCC states. So they are being militarized and nominally in terms of the size and capacities of those militaries. And one can assume, therefore, that the ambitions and powers in the political realm of those militaries are necessarily increasing. Leadership succession, as I just mentioned, is becoming increasingly problematical, partly because of the size of the family dynasties has increased. And so struggles over them could likely then draw in whether militaries or other participants, which heretofore have not played a role in those successions. And then lastly, so this was Roger Owen's lovely term, but he was approaching it from the other angle. Jumlakiya, so the merging of the republics and the monarchies, he saw the republics becoming more like monarchies, and here we're arguing the monarchies are becoming more like the republics. Now, why do they matter? Why should we care about these things? Well, as they preserve limited access orders, and all this work at the bank has suggested they're highly inimical to rates of economic development. So as the gatekeeper to those limited access orders, deep states necessarily deter development. Secondly, they render reform extremely difficult. And this whole literature on pacted reforms that grow out of Latin America is really inapplicable in the Middle East precisely because of these deep states. They elevate and legitimate coercion as an important ingredient in the exercise of political power, even on a day-to-day basis. They gatekeep not just internal relations, but relations with external actors as well, and typically creaming off some of the benefits of those interactions. And then lastly, deep states are at the core of the regimes that are forming a, quote, global club, which is increasingly threatening democratic order in its institutions globally. All right, so that's the deep state in the Middle East, but what about elsewhere? Is this concept been stretched too far by President Trump and others, or are there really deep states? And I think the bottom line is no, these are different things. In open access orders, as all democracies are, what is the purported role of the deep state? Is it somehow different than, as it seems, you can easily conceptualize Trump's struggle with his own bureaucracy as a sort of a yes minister phenomenon of the bureaucracy having its own interest and one of expertise as opposed to politics. And I suspect that's much more to the truth of Trump's problems with his own bureaucracy than it is that they are part of a deep state orchestrated by Nancy Pelosi or some other Democrat. Can you have a deep state that doesn't exercise direct power over coercion? And that seems highly unlikely. Coercion is absolutely vital to their role. And indeed, it supplants, as I said, the normal functioning of politics. So that's another one. And the Trumpian argument is it just information control. But information control in democracies is much less than what Putin has or what Sisi has in Egypt. So that amount of control is indeed very much less. So that's it. And I'm sorry to have had all these technical glitches along the way. And I'm also sorry not to have, because my sort of interest in this whole topic, this is focusing on the political nuts and bolts of trying to explain economic outcomes. And you've had nothing about those economic outcomes in terms of how the state affects them and what its shortcomings along a whole series of dimensions are. So I'd simply urge you to buy the book, and that's where it all is. So without further ado, thank you for your patience.